Think you know everything about the 1997 romantic comedy Sprung? This overlooked gem starring Tisha Campbell and Paula is packed with bizarre behind-the-scenes secrets, legendary TV sitcom cameos, missing soundtrack mysteries, and wild special effects that'll make you see this underrated film in a whole new light. Get ready for some seriously surprising revelations about Rusty Cundieff's romantic romp. Fact 1. The Jeffersons reunion. Nobody saw coming. When audiences settled in to watch Sprung in 1997, they probably weren't expecting to see a surprise reunion from one of television's most beloved sitcom couples. Isabel Sanford and Sherman Hemsley, who had charmed America as Louise and George Jefferson on the groundbreaking CBS sitcom The Jeffersons, both appeared in small but memorable cameo roles in Rusty Cundieff's romantic comedy. The Jeffersons had been a cultural phenomenon during its 11-year run, from 1975 to 1985, making Sanford and Hemsley household names as the affluent African-American couple who had moved on up to the East Side. By the time Sprung was being filmed in the mid-90s, both actors were well into their later careers, making their joint appearance in the movie something of a nostalgic treat for fans who remembered their on-screen chemistry. What makes this reunion particularly poignant is that it would be one of the last times moviegoers would see these two television legends sharing screen time together. Isabel Sanford continued working sporadically in film and television throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, but her appearances became increasingly rare as she aged. Sadly, she passed away in 2004 at the age of 86, just 7 years after Sprung's release. For Sherman Hemsley, the Sprung cameo was part of his continued work in independent films during the 90s, as he took on smaller roles in various projects after The Jeffersons ended. The fact that director Rusty Cundieff managed to get both actors to appear in his modestly budgeted romantic comedy speaks to the respect he commanded in the industry, especially considering that many viewers had no idea these television icons were even in the movie until they spotted them on screen. Fact 2. A Tales from the Hood cast reunion. What many viewers didn't realize while watching Sprung was that they were witnessing an unusual cast reunion that crossed genre boundaries in a way that rarely happens in Hollywood. 5 actors from Rusty Cundieff's previous film, the horror anthology Tales from the Hood, appeared together again in this romantic comedy, creating an unexpected bridge between two completely different types of movies. Tales from the Hood had been released just 2 years earlier in 1995, and it was a critically acclaimed horror film that used supernatural stories to address serious social issues affecting African American communities. The movie featured an ensemble cast that included several actors who would later show up in Sprung's much lighter romantic storyline. The reunion included Clarence Williams III, who had played the mysterious funeral director Mr. Sims in Tales from the Hood, and appeared as Granddaddy in Sprung. Joe Torre, who had been one of the 3 young drug dealers in the horror film's wraparound story, took on the role of Clyde, one of Sprung's male leads. Paula, who had appeared in the horror anthology, returned as Adina, the gold-digging best friend who drives much of Sprung's plot. Director and star Rusty Cundieff naturally appeared in both films, and there was even a 5th actor who crossed over between the 2 projects. This kind of genre-hopping reunion was particularly unusual because Tales from the Hood dealt with heavy themes like police brutality, domestic violence, and systemic racism through horror storytelling, while Sprung was a lighthearted romantic comedy focused on dating mishaps and relationship humor. The fact that Cundieff was able to bring so many of his horror film collaborators into his romantic comedy shows the strong working relationships he had built with these actors and their willingness to follow him into completely different creative territory. Fact 3. The Missing Party Song Mystery. One of the most frustrating mysteries for Sprung fans involves a catchy song that plays during a crucial scene in the movie, but somehow never made it onto the official soundtrack album. The track in question is "You Want This Party Started" by the R&B group Something for the People, and it plays during the scene where Clyde and his friend Montel are getting ready to go to the party where they'll meet their future romantic interests. The song fits perfectly with the movie's upbeat, party-ready vibe and became memorable to viewers who heard it during that pivotal preparation sequence. However, when fans went looking for the complete Sprung soundtrack, which was released by Q-West Records and featured music composed by jazz legend Stanley Clarke, they discovered that "You Want This Party Started" was nowhere to be found on the track listing. This omission created a genuine mystery that lasted for years, with movie fans posting on early internet forums and music identification websites trying to figure out what that catchy song was and where they could find it. The situation became even more puzzling because Something for the People was a well-known group at the time, having released several successful singles in the mid-90s, so it wasn't as if the track came from an obscure or hard-to-find artist. The mystery finally got solved many years later when one dedicated fan managed to track down the song's title and artist, posting the information online in September of 2018. By that time, more than 20 years had passed since the movie's release, making it one of the longest-running soundtrack mysteries in 90s cinema. The song had actually been released as a single by Something for the People back in 1995, but for unknown reasons related to music licensing or soundtrack compilation decisions, it simply never made it onto the official Sprung album. Fact 4. Stanley Clarke's jazz legend status. While Sprung might have seemed like a modest romantic comedy on the surface, it actually featured music composed by one of the most accomplished and respected musicians in jazz history. Stanley Clarke, who handled the film's musical score, was far from a typical movie composer looking for work in Hollywood during the mid-90s, but rather a genuine music legend, whose credentials were almost absurdly impressive for a film of this scale and budget. Clarke had co-founded Return to Forever in the early 1970s alongside pianist Chick Corea, creating one of the most influential jazz fusion bands ever assembled. The group revolutionized how people thought about combining jazz with rock and other musical styles, and their work helped define what jazz fusion would become for decades to follow. As a bass player, Clarke had achieved something that very few musicians in his field ever managed, becoming the first jazz fusion bassist to headline major tours and sell out concert venues around the world as a solo artist. By the time he signed on to compose music for Sprung, Clarke had already won 4 Grammy Awards and had been nominated for 15 total, making him one of the most awarded musicians ever to work on a low-budget romantic comedy. His resume included collaborations with some of the biggest names in music, from Miles Davis to Herbie Hancock, and he had composed scores for major Hollywood films including Boys and the Hood and Romeo Must Die. The fact that director Rusty Cundieff managed to secure someone of Clarke's stature for his relatively small independent film speaks to either exceptional networking skills or the respect that Cundieff had earned in the industry after his previous movies. For audiences watching Sprung, they were hearing music crafted by a musician whose bass guitar is permanently displayed at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Fact 5. The wardrobe malfunction continuity error. Movie fans who pay close attention to details during fight scenes might notice one of the most bizarre costume continuity errors in romantic comedy history during a confrontation between Adina and Clyde in Sprung. When Adina discovers that Clyde has been lying about his wealth and starts physically attacking him, viewers with sharp eyes can catch a truly strange wardrobe malfunction that somehow made it through the editing process and into the final cut of the film. The scene involves Paula Jai Parker's character, Adina, punching Joe Torre's character, Clyde, after she realizes he's been deceiving her about being wealthy. As the fight unfolds and the camera cuts between different angles to capture the action, Clyde's underwear undergoes a magical transformation that defies the laws of physics and basic filmmaking continuity. In the initial shots of the scene, Clyde is clearly wearing briefs, which is what most viewers would expect to see during this type of comedic physical altercation. However, during one particular shot in the middle of the fight sequence, his underwear mysteriously changes from briefs to shorts without any logical explanation for how this could have happened. The transformation occurs between camera cuts, suggesting that multiple takes were filmed with different wardrobe pieces, and the editor either didn't notice the inconsistency or ran out of alternative footage to use. What makes this continuity error even more peculiar is that the underwear then changes back to briefs again in subsequent shots, creating a truly mystifying sequence where Clyde's undergarments seem to have a mind of their own. This type of costume continuity mistake is relatively rare in professional filmmaking, especially involving such a specific and noticeable piece of clothing, making it one of those movie goofs that sharp-eyed viewers love to point out and discuss on internet forums dedicated to film mistakes. Fact 6. John Witherspoon's legendary police lineup scene. Comedy fans who know John Witherspoon primarily from his memorable roles in the Friday movie series might be surprised to discover that he delivered one of his most brilliant comedic performances in a small but unforgettable scene in Sprung. Witherspoon appears as a police detective conducting a lineup, and what was supposed to be a relatively straightforward scene turned into something much more special thanks to his natural comedic timing and apparent willingness to improvise dialogue that wasn't necessarily in the original script. The scene has become legendary among people who appreciate Witherspoon's particular brand of deadpan humor, with many comedy fans considering it to be his funniest work outside of his well-known character Willie Jones from the Friday franchise. What makes the performance so memorable is Witherspoon's ability to deliver lines with his signature combination of authority and absurdity, creating a character who takes his job seriously while saying things that are completely ridiculous. The police lineup sequence showcases Witherspoon at his comedic best, using his distinctive voice and timing to turn what could have been a throwaway scene into something that viewers remember long after the movie ends. His performance in this brief appearance demonstrates why he became such a beloved figure in comedy, particularly within the African-American film community of the 1990s. What's particularly interesting about this scene is that it represents Witherspoon working with director Rusty Cundieff, who clearly understood how to use the comedian's talents effectively. The fact that such a small role in a relatively modest romantic comedy could generate so much appreciation from comedy fans speaks to both Witherspoon's skill as a performer and Cundieff's ability to recognize when an actor was bringing something special to a scene and give them the freedom to make it their own. Fact 7. The director wore multiple creative hats. Rusty Cundieff took on an unusually demanding workload when he made Sprung, handling 3 major creative roles that most filmmakers would typically divide among different people. Not only did he direct the entire movie and star as one of the lead characters, Montel, but he also co-wrote the screenplay alongside his frequent collaborator Darren Scott, making him one of the rare filmmaker actors in Hollywood to successfully juggle this kind of triple responsibility on a studio-backed romantic comedy. This level of creative control was particularly impressive, given that Sprung was distributed by Trimark Pictures as a mainstream release, not an ultra-low-budget independent film where wearing multiple hats might be more common out of financial necessity. Cundieff had already proven his ability to handle multiple roles with his previous films Fear of a Black Hat and Tales from the Hood, but taking on the lead acting role, while also directing and writing, presented unique challenges that few filmmakers attempt. The demands of playing Montel, the sensitive photographer who serves as one half of the romantic storyline, while simultaneously managing all the technical and creative aspects of directing, meant that Cundieff had to maintain focus on his character's emotional journey, even while dealing with typical behind-the-scenes responsibilities like working with the cinematographer, managing the schedule, and directing his co-stars. Working as both writer and director gave Cundieff complete creative control over the story and how it was told, while his role as the male romantic lead meant he was literally living inside the story he had created. This kind of comprehensive involvement in a project is relatively rare in Hollywood, where the different roles of writer, director, and lead actor are usually kept separate to avoid conflicts of interest and to ensure that each job gets the full attention it deserves. Fact 8. Trimark Pictures Tiger Triangle Connection. Sprung was distributed by Trimark Pictures, a company that had built its reputation on releasing films that other studios might have considered too risky or controversial for mainstream audiences. Founded by Mark Amen in 1984 as Vidmark Entertainment before becoming Trimark Pictures, the company specialized in horror films, exploitation movies, and lower-budget productions that often pushed boundaries in terms of content and subject matter. What made Trimark particularly memorable to movie fans wasn't just their willingness to distribute edgy films, but their distinctive company logo that appeared at the beginning of their movies. The logo featured a golden triangle with the profile of a tiger's head emerging through wind effects, accompanied by dramatic music that built to a triumphant fanfare with an explosive sound at the end that fans often described as a boom. This logo became something of a cult phenomenon among people who collect and study movie company logos, earning the nickname the Cheesy Triangle Lion due to its dramatic animation style and over-the-top musical accompaniment. The tiger head logo gained such a following that it's still discussed and remembered decades later by fans who grew up watching Trimark releases on home video during the 90s. Trimark's catalog included horror franchises like Leprechaun and Warlock, as well as controversial films that sometimes had trouble finding newspaper advertising because of their content. The company was known for taking chances on directors and projects that bigger studios might have passed on, making them an ideal home for independent filmmakers who wanted creative control over their projects. By 2000, Trimark had been acquired by Lionsgate Entertainment, and their distinctive triangle logo was eventually replaced, making it one of those lost pieces of 90s movie nostalgia that only appears now on older DVD releases and vintage home video copies. Fact 9. The School Days Connection. Nearly a decade before Tisha Campbell and Rusty Cundieff would star together as romantic leads in Sprung, both actors had appeared in one of the most important African-American films of the 1980s. Spike Lee's School Days, released in 1988, featured both performers in supporting roles that helped establish their careers in Hollywood, making their later collaboration in Sprung an unexpected reunion that most viewers probably never noticed. In School Days, Tisha Campbell played Jane Toussaint, a character who was part of the complex social dynamics that Lee was exploring at the fictional Mission College. The film examined colorism, class differences, and social hierarchies within the African-American community through the lens of college life, and Campbell's role was part of the ensemble that brought these themes to life. Rusty Cundieff appeared in the same film as Big Brother Chucky, a fraternity member who participated in the hazing and social rituals that formed a crucial part of School Days' storyline. For Cundieff, who was still early in his career as both an actor and filmmaker, working with Spike Lee provided valuable experience that would influence his own directorial work in later years. The fact that these two performers, who had shared scenes in Lee's ambitious and socially conscious musical drama, would later reunite as the romantic leads in a lighthearted comedy shows how the relatively small world of African-American cinema in the 90s often brought the same talented people together in different contexts. School Days had been a breakthrough film that launched or advanced several careers, and seeing Campbell and Cundieff work together again in Sprung represented a kind of full-circle moment for actors who had started out in Lee's groundbreaking college-set musical. Fact 10. Roger Ebert's backhanded compliment. When Roger Ebert reviewed Sprung for the Chicago Sun-Times in May of 1997, he delivered one of the most creatively brutal film reviews in his long career as America's most influential movie critic. Rather than simply criticizing the film on its own merits, Ebert used his entire review as an opportunity to praise a completely different movie, turning his assessment of Sprung into an extended backhanded compliment for another romantic comedy. Ebert opened his review with the memorable line that sometimes it takes one movie to show you how good another movie was, explaining that Sprung provided that service for Booty Call. Both films were what he called sex-coms about two couples, both were cheerfully vulgar, and both featured lots of sex and slapstick comedy. But Ebert argued that Booty Call worked while Sprung did not, despite its focus on a sweet relationship. This approach was unusual even for Ebert, who was known for his sharp wit and ability to find creative ways to express his disappointment with films he didn't enjoy. Instead of spending his review explaining what was wrong with Sprung, he used the movie as a measuring stick to highlight what was right about Booty Call, essentially turning his critique into a recommendation for a different film entirely. The review became a perfect example of Ebert's skill as a writer and critic, showing how he could take a negative assessment and turn it into something more interesting than a simple pan. By using Sprung as a way to illuminate the strengths of another movie, Ebert created a review that was probably more memorable and entertaining than the film itself, demonstrating why he remained the most widely read film critic in America throughout his career. Fact 11. The Terminator Vision Party Sequence. One of the most unexpectedly bizarre moments in Sprung occurs during a party scene where director Rusty Cundieff decided to incorporate special effects that seem completely out of place in a romantic comedy. The sequence features characters experiencing what can only be described as Terminator vision, where the camera shows us the world through a character's eyes using digital overlays and targeting systems that were clearly inspired by the famous point-of-view shots from the Terminator movies. What makes this visual effect even more surreal is that during these moments, some of the people at the party are literally shown as dogs wearing human clothing, creating a visual metaphor that's both strange and oddly memorable. The effect appears to represent how certain characters view the dating scene around them, with potential romantic partners being seen as animals in a predatory social environment. This kind of science fiction-inspired visual gag was highly unusual for romantic comedies in the mid-90s, when most films in the genre relied on more traditional filmmaking techniques and avoided the kind of digital effects that were becoming common in action movies. The choice to include these effects in Sprung shows Cundieff's willingness to experiment with different visual styles, even when they didn't necessarily fit the overall tone of the movie. Roger Ebert specifically mentioned these special effects in his review, noting that it was amusing when Cundieff used them during scenes like Adina's inventory sequence, where mental cash registers ring as she calculates a man's worth. The Terminator Vision Party sequence represents the kind of creative risk-taking that made Sprung stand out from other romantic comedies of its era, even if the results were more weird than successful in terms of serving the story. Fact 12. Siskel. Ebert's rare rom-com coverage. Getting featured on Siskel, Ebert was considered one of the most important forms of film criticism exposure in the 1990s, and Sprung managed to earn a spot on the legendary television show in May of 1997. This was particularly significant because Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert typically focused their attention on major studio releases, foreign art films, and movies they considered either exceptionally good or notably terrible, making it unusual for a modestly budgeted romantic comedy from an independent distributor to receive their coverage. The show, which had evolved from its earlier incarnation as sneak previews, had become the most influential film review program on television by the mid-90s, with the famous two-thumbs-up rating system becoming a widely recognized mark of critical approval that could significantly impact a movie's box office performance. For smaller films without major marketing budgets, appearing on Siskel, Ebert could mean the difference between obscurity and finding an audience. What made Sprung's appearance on the show even more remarkable was that low-budget African-American romantic comedies rarely received attention from mainstream film critics during this period, despite the fact that there was a growing audience for these types of movies. The film industry was still largely segregated in terms of which movies received serious critical attention, making Siskel, Ebert's decision to review Sprung, a noteworthy moment for representation in film criticism. The episode that featured Sprung also included reviews of other May 1997 releases, placing the film alongside bigger-budget productions and giving it the same level of serious critical consideration that major studio movies typically receive. This kind of exposure was invaluable for independent films trying to build word-of-mouth awareness beyond their core demographic. Fact 13. The fast food manager's fake fortune. The entire romantic plot of Sprung depends on one of the most ridiculous deceptions in romantic comedy history, where Joe Torre's character Clyde manages to convince a supposedly expert gold digger that he's wealthy using nothing more than a borrowed car key and a piece of paper. What makes this con job particularly absurd is that Clyde is actually just a manager at a fast food restaurant, which is about as far from wealthy as someone can get while still holding down steady employment. Clyde's elaborate scheme involves flashing the key ring to a Porsche that doesn't belong to him and casually dropping a fake bank receipt that suggests he has significant money in his account. These props are apparently convincing enough to fool Adina, played by Paula Parker, who is supposed to be a professional manhunter, with what Roger Ebert described as laser-like ability to calculate a man's worth by running an inventory on what he's wearing, while mental cash registers ring. The fact that such a simple deception works on someone whose entire expertise is supposed to be identifying wealthy men creates one of those plot holes that viewers either have to accept for the sake of enjoying the movie or spend the entire film wondering how Adina could be so easily fooled. The borrowed Porsche key and fake bank receipt represent the kind of low-effort scam that might work on someone who wasn't paying attention, but should never fool a person whose livelihood depends on accurately assessing men's financial status. This central deception becomes even more questionable when you consider that Adina is portrayed as someone who has made gold digging into an art form, yet she apparently never bothers to do any basic verification of Clyde's claims about his wealth before getting involved with him, making their entire relationship based on a lie that should have been easily discovered. Fact 14. The costume designer's 90s fashion time capsule. Costume designer Tracy White created what many fashion enthusiasts consider to be some of the most perfectly executed 1990s wardrobe choices ever captured on film, turning Sprung into an unintentional time capsule of mid-decade African-American style. White's work on the film has been praised by viewers who appreciate authentic period fashion, with many noting that the costumes feel genuine to the era rather than like Hollywood's interpretation of how people dressed during that time. The standout piece that has earned the most attention from style watchers is a tie and suspenders combination worn by Joe Torre's character Clyde that has been described by fans as spectacularly fly and representative of Pantheon-level costume design. This particular outfit perfectly captured the kind of bold, coordinated look that was popular among young African-American men during the mid-90s, combining formal elements like suspenders with contemporary styling in a way that looked both fashionable and authentic. White's costume choices throughout the film demonstrate a deep understanding of how different characters would have dressed based on their personalities and social positions, from Paula Jai Parker's glamorous outfits as the gold-digging Adina to the more understated but still stylish clothing worn by Tisha Campbell's law clerk character Brandy. The attention to detail in the wardrobe helps establish each character's identity and social status without being heavy-handed about it. What makes White's work particularly impressive is that the costumes have aged well from a fashion perspective, with many of the looks still appearing stylish and well-coordinated when viewed decades later. This kind of timeless quality in period costume design is relatively rare, especially for contemporary films where the fashion choices can quickly look dated or overly trendy when viewed years after their original release. Fact 15. The box office surprise performance. While critics like Roger Ebert were less than enthusiastic about Sprung, audiences told a different story with their wallets, helping the film earn over $7.5 million worldwide against what was clearly a very modest production budget. This box office performance represented a genuine success for Trimark Pictures, especially considering that the company specialized in lower-budget independent films that often struggled to find wide theatrical audiences during the competitive summer movie season of 1997. The film's financial success demonstrated something that Hollywood studios were still learning during the 90s, which was that there was a significant audience for African-American romantic comedies that wasn't being fully served by major studio releases. Sprung managed to connect with viewers who were looking for romantic entertainment that reflected their own experiences and cultural references, even when the film's execution wasn't perfect according to professional critics. What made this box office performance particularly impressive was that Trimark Pictures didn't have the massive marketing budgets that major studios used to promote their romantic comedies, meaning that much of Sprung's audience probably found the movie through word-of-mouth recommendations or by discovering it in theaters without extensive advance publicity. The film's ability to earn over $7 million under these circumstances suggested that audiences were genuinely responding to the chemistry between the cast members and the story's romantic elements. This kind of sleeper success was exactly what independent distributors like Trimark needed to stay profitable, proving that modestly budgeted films could find their audience and generate solid returns when they connected with underserved demographics. The worldwide gross also indicated that Sprung had appeal beyond just domestic audiences, making it a well-rounded financial success for everyone involved in its production and distribution.